Topping our news on the world stage, President Trump heading to Vietnam for his second summit with Kim Jong-un, looking to bridge the nuclear gap with the North Korean dictator.
I think we'll have a very tremendous summit. We want denuclearization, and I think he'll have a country that will set a lot of records for speed in terms of an economy.
Chief White House correspondent John Roberts is live from Hanoi, joining us now as the president embarks across to the other side of the world. John?
Yeah, good morning to you, Molly from Vietnam. Good afternoon to you there in New York City, where President Trump is aboard Air Force One winging his way here. At the same time, Kim Jong-un is on a heavily armed train making a 3.5-day journey from Pyongyang through the Chinese countryside, 2,500 miles to get to the China-Vietnam border, upon which he will board a motorcade and travel by car the remaining 105 miles to Vietnam. As the two leaders prepare to meet in 3 days, new concerns being raised by American officials about the direction that talks leading up to this summit have been going. According to a senior administration official who spoke with Fox News, there is concern at the White House, the State Department, the Pentagon, the Treasury Department, and the Energy Department that President Trump's special envoy to North Korea, Stephen Biegun, has been willing to offer too much in his talks with North Korean officials. Biegun is a businessman, former diplomat, who the president appointed to set the table for talks. Some of the big concerns, according to the official, denuclearization has become a negotiating point rather than the non-negotiable promise that Kim Jong-un made at last June's Singapore summit. U.S. officials do not want South Korea engaging economically with North Korea until North Korea makes more progress toward denuclearization. And there are concerns about promised cultural exchanges between South and North Korea. North Korea has been offered a lot, these American officials feel, without having to give up anything. According to the official, North Korea is not negotiating to get an agreement. North Korea is negotiating to extend its livelihood. The official adds the U.S. does not want to make a deal just to make a deal, and that the U.S. did not certainly want to give away something for nothing. Those concerns aside, though, President Trump is optimistic about moving the ball down the field later on this week. Here he is at the Governors Association dinner last night.
We've given up nothing. We have a special feeling, and I think it's going to lead to something very good, and maybe not. I think ultimately it will, but maybe not. And I'm not pushing for speed, but we're not removing the sanctions. And we're going to have, I think, a very interesting 2.5 days in Vietnam.
There is a lot of concern that while North Korea has stopped testing its weapons, it hasn't taken any concrete steps toward dismantling its nuclear program other than to close a couple of facilities that it didn't need anyways. In light of what I've been told about the concerns of the State Department, the White House, the DOD, Treasury, and Energy, it's unclear how the president is going to approach the talks with Kim Jong-un on Thursday here in Vietnam. But it may be, Molly, that he takes back some of the carrot that his chief negotiator has extended to North Korea in recent weeks.
Yeah, it seems the president is playing things a bit close to the vest for now, so we will see a lot to talk about there. John, we'll see you later on reporting throughout the week on this important summit. Thank you. For more on this, let's bring in A.B. Stoddard, an associate editor and columnist for Real Clear Politics. A.B., thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Molly.
Well, you know, as the president is in the air heading for North Korea, there's a lot of talk about just what exactly could potentially come out of this as far as something concrete is concerned, and what would be what America could do to feel like this was worthwhile, to claim some sort of win for the administration. What do you think that would be? What would be a win coming back from that summit?
Well, the original summit ended with broad goals for denuclearization. And within a couple of months, we were already in sort of crosshairs with North Korea. A trip by Secretary of State Pompeo was canceled. The North Koreans made it clear they didn't want to deal with Mike Pompeo, just with the president. All of the experts say that they have not taken substantial steps to denuclearize. And our own government, not only intelligence officials like Gina Haspel from the CIA and DNI Dan Coats, have basically articulated that they remain a threat and that they would not be perceived as intending to give up their nuclear weapons. The missile defense report that came out of our own Pentagon in January calls North Korea, in terms of its capability to reach us with missiles, an extraordinary threat. So there cannot be a third summit unless the president gets some kind of timetable with certainty on the definition of denuclearization from Chairman Kim. We don't know what he's going to call in at the end of this. He's been very clear in recent days that he's not asking so much for denuclearization as that he's just really happy there's been a pause in testing. He's said that several times. I'm not in a rush. I just don't want testing. And so he's lowered the threshold for concessions. And I think it's, not only does Chairman Kim win when he has a summit with the U.S. president, something his own family sought for decades.
But so you argue the North Koreans have already won this just by the president flying there.
Well, also the Russians and the Chinese, after the first summit last summer, they eased trade restrictions on the North Koreans. So that helped the North Korean economy. So it really needs to be a step towards actual arms reduction. And we'll have to wait to see, what comes out of the talks.
Meanwhile, as the president is overseas, things are very, very busy in Washington, D.C. There's a whole a slate of things on the plate this week. But one of the big things to watch is that the House is scheduled to vote on this resolution to terminate the president's efforts as far as a national emergency is declared. They want to roll that back. And potentially, the president said he'd be happy to veto if things actually go through. Now, there are a few Republicans that have signed on for this resolution. Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Tend to be rather an independent voice among Republicans. What does this mean as far as kind of calling Republicans out, making them put a foot down as far as where they stand on this emergency declaration?
This is a very tough vote for Republicans, Molly. Not only conservatives in safe red districts who have always pledged their allegiance to the Constitution and small government, limited government, the powers of our checks and balances in our Constitution, the Congress's Article 1 mandated power of the purse. This is a very tough vote for them, but also the members who are in swing districts where they're vulnerable. And next year, they don't want to be on the record setting this precedent. So
I do think the president does end up putting that veto forward.
Well, I think he is going to veto. I don't think the Congress will have a supermajority vote against him, and I think he will lose in lower courts. But the way that the law is written, it likely survives. The law was written so broadly for the president's executive authority that he's likely to prevail in the Supreme Court, and it is likely to survive a constitutional challenge. And so that sets up a question for Republicans going forward. Is this something a Democratic president could use, since that law from 1976 is so permissive in this front? So that's the debate going on behind closed doors right now. It's a very painful one for Republicans. I do think that you'll see enough Republicans like Susan Collins. They just need 4 to get to 51 to reject it in the Senate. Then it'll face a veto, and then I think it moves on, and he ultimately prevails.
All right, A.B., thank you so much. The other thing to watch, of course, is Michael Cohen testifying up there on Capitol Hill and those and behind closed doors as well. It'll be a fascinating week, even as the president's overseas. A.B. Stoddard, thank you.
Thanks.
Fox News alert, Vice President Mike Pence heading home after meeting with Colombia's president in Bogota. The VP is voicing support for Venezuela's opposition leader Juan Guaido as the humanitarian crisis there boils over after a weekend of violence. Protesters clashing with Venezuelan troops deployed to the borders to block desperately needed food and medicine from entering the country. Benjamin Hall is live in London with more. Benjamin?
Yeah, hi, Molly. And there were quite remarkable scenes this weekend. These were forces loyal to Nicolas Maduro holding back aid workers, opening fire on aid workers who were trying to bring in much-needed food and medicine to the starving people of Venezuela. Well, today, as you say, Vice President Pence flew into Colombia to meet with the leaders and foreign ministers of 13 other countries looking to find a solution to this growing crisis. He announced tough new sanctions against government members, and he called on the people of Venezuela to stand up to the regime, saying the tragic events of this past weekend have only steeled the resolve of the U.S. to stand with you. He also announced another $56 million in aid on top of the $139 million that the U.S. has already. But at the moment, it feels something has to give. Yeah. Molly?
So many innocent people caught in the crosshairs, not just, literally, but politically as well. Jonathan Hall, thank you for the update. Fox News alert. We are awaiting a news conference from Florida where officials are expected to detail the prostitution charges. Actually, it's just getting started. These are regarding the prostitution, human trafficking charges down there in Florida. Let's listen.
I'm with PIO Mike Edmondson and Latasha Logood. On Friday, February 22nd, the Jupiter Police Department gave us case filing packets stemming from their prostitution sting. After review by our intake prosecutors, we are charging 25 individuals with soliciting another to commit prostitution, pursuant to sections 796.07, 2F, and 5A1 of the Florida statutes. This charge is a first-degree misdemeanor, punishable by up to 1 year in jail, a mandatory $5,000 fine, 100 hours of community service, and a class on the dangers of prostitution and human trafficking. We also expect to receive filing packets for the 2 women who have been arrested by the Jupiter Police Department for, among other things, deriving support from the proceeds of prostitution, which is a second-degree felony. All defendants are presumed innocent at this point. The charges begin the court process with local defendants being mailed a summons to appear in court. Out-of-county defendants will have a capias issued, which is essentially a low-level warrant, and will have to either surrender or have an attorney contact law enforcement to satisfy the warrant. The clerk's office will publicly release court dates for those receiving a summons, and the names of all the defendants will be released. And actually they have been released already. The names of all defendants already have been released by the Jupiter Police Department. I'd like to thank the men and women of the Jupiter Police Department for their professionalism and diligence in investigating these cases. It's our ongoing partnership with local law enforcement that helps keep our community safe. You can tell a lot about our community by the way it treats its most vulnerable individuals, and that includes victims of human trafficking, which is modern-day slavery. Human trafficking is the business of stealing someone's freedom for profit, including, it can happen anywhere, including in the peaceful community of Jupiter, Florida. In 2017, our office joined with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office and the FBI to help start a human trafficking task force. We're pleased with our progress, but we realize there's a lot more to do. These cases aren't about any one defendant or any group of defendants. The larger picture, which we must all confront, is the cold reality that many prostitutes in cases like this are themselves victims, often lured into this country with promises of a better life, only to be forced to live and work in a sweatshop or a brothel, performing sex acts for strangers. Human trafficking is built on force, fraud, or coercion. It is evil in our midst. It is also fueled by the demand side, demands from otherwise law-abiding citizens who are not aware or don't want to be aware about those being exploited. Human trafficking often occurs in plain sight, which is why I'm hopeful that these cases will encourage people to say something if they see something, and for victims of this unreported crime to gain the courage to let their voices be heard. With that, I'd like to take any questions you may have.
Again, please identify yourself.
Yes. No, if they are local residents, meaning if they live in Palm Beach County, they will receive a summons in the mail. It's like a ticket, a notice to appear in court. And that court date can be found through the clerk's office. If they are from out of the county, then they're subject to a capias, which is in effect a low-level warrant. And that one, they would either have to surrender to the authorities, or they could have an attorney reach out and satisfy the warrant. There is no requirement.
Ted Scott from CBS4 in Miami. Is there any kind of evidence or anything to say that any of these people, any of the 25 citizens, knew that this was a human trafficking situation?
Well, the matters are still being investigated, and I don't want to get too much into the details of the case because this is a pending matter. But I can say this, that so far there have been no charges of human trafficking in any of these cases, but that could change in the future depending on what the investigators find.
Naila Charles, CBS 12.
Some of these investigations are months long. They last a while. I know one of these cases was close to a year. Monitoring these situations, we know we want to get this right in terms of charging everyone involved. But at the same time, you have these women who are victims going against their will, doing this for months as we're monitoring the situation. So how do you kind of find the compromise between monitoring and making sure you're getting everything right in terms of what you want to charge, but also knowing that these women are suffering another day, another month?
Right. Those are questions for the investigators, the police. The Jupiter Police engaged in a multi-month investigation, and then they turned over the filing packets to our office for prosecution. I think the question you have would be more geared towards the investigators, but they're very professional, and I think they did an outstanding job. So, it's always a balance, as you say, between letting the conduct continue to gain enough evidence to file charges and stepping in and stopping it. But that is really a question for the investigators.
Terry Spencer from Associated
Yes, sir.
Press. First, two questions. Where are the women who are working or captive in the brothels? And also, do you think state law is sufficient right now to deal with this situation?
I was a state senator when we tightened the laws against human trafficking. Florida law is very strong against human trafficking. It is a first-degree felony for most cases of adult human trafficking. When it comes to child human trafficking, it is a life felony. And if there's force involved, some violence involved, then an adult human trafficking would become a potential life felony. So our punishments are severe, but there's a high burden of proof. You need to reach that burden of proof, and that's always the question in these cases, which is why these investigations can take some time. But one thing will mention about Florida law is that Florida law is also very progressive. If victims of human trafficking will speak up, they are eligible to have their records expunged, including arrests for prostitution. But they need to speak up. At the federal level, human trafficking victims are eligible for a T visa, which is a visa that can allow them to stay in the country, and it's only reserved for victims of human trafficking. So the key is to get the victims to speak up.
Where are the women now?
The women now, I know that the investigators have been talking with them, and you'd have to go get details from those agencies such as Jupiter Police Department.
Hey, Carol from NBC. Florida has a new law that protects victims of crime from having their information revealed. Is there any way that the clients, the Johns here, are considered victims?
No. Marcy's law does not protect defendants. Marcy's law protects victims of crime.
Danielle Wong from CBS 12. These documents you just handed out would put Robert Kraft in the parlor on the morning of the AFC Championship game. Is that correct? He was in Jupiter, Florida that morning?
Well, the documents speak for themselves. What we handed out were the capias themselves, and I know that we don't always give out those documents, but because the Jupiter Police Department identified the names in advance, and you all had the names for some time, we decided to, in the interest of transparency, to let you have those documents, but they speak for themselves.
His influence and money and power and connections. Is there any reason to believe that Robert Kraft would be treated any differently than these other 24 men?
And I can assure you that our office treats everyone the same, whether you have a lot of money or you are indigent. We treat all defendants the same, and no one gets any special justice in Palm Beach County.
Naila Charles, CBS 12 News. Do you expect more arrests to come from other similar businesses within Palm Beach County?
Well, it's hard to say because the investigators are the Jupiter Police, and then you have the Martin County Sheriff's Department, you have Vero Beach. This is a multi-county effort, and so it's hard to say if there are more arrests based on their investigations. But I was asked earlier today about rumors about bigger fish, and I said that would be news to me. And I also added that, it's hard for me to talk about rumors, especially false ones. No, there are two cases there. There are 2 counts. Correct.
If your office decided to go from a second-degree misdemeanor to a first-degree misdemeanor, what was it about the fact that you decided to up it to what is the most that you can do in this case?
Well, all the cases are being charged as first-degree misdemeanors under the tougher Florida statute, and one reason why that decision was made was because that statute has a mandatory 100 hours of community service, a mandatory $5,000 fine, and a mandatory class on the dangers of prostitution and human trafficking, not to mention a potential for an increased jail sentence from 60 days to a year.
Robert Kraft owns multiple homes here and up in Massachusetts and California. Would he be given a habeas or a summons? How would you deal with it?
There was a question whether or not Mr. Kraft lived here in Palm Beach County, and I believe we decided it was a summons, so he does have a residence here, so he'd be receiving a summons.
Will they be receiving mugshots?
Oh, the question is mugshots. When you get a summons in the mail, generally you do not get a mugshot. Now remember, that's up to the police department. It's not up to us. It's up to the local law enforcement agency.
Has he already been sent that summons?
Has it already been sent that summons? His attorney has been provided the summons.
Do you think it should be a really big deal about putting their mugshots and their driver's license out, pictures out? You guys are handling that a little bit differently here. Do you feel like, are you happy with the way it's being handled?
I think that law enforcement has done an excellent job. They've been very professional and very thorough. And also, they've helped steer the conversation away from any one particular defendant, from any group of defendants, towards the evil of human trafficking. It's about time the country has a real conversation about human trafficking, which is modern-day slavery in our midst. This is not about lonely old men or victimless crimes. This is about enabling a network of criminals to traffic women into our country for forced labor and sex.
How did you come up with these 25 people charged? Aren't there a lot more passing through the parlor?
Well, those are the ones charged by the Jupiter Police Department. My jurisdiction is only for Palm Beach County. And by the way, when I talk about human trafficking, I'm talking about the general subject of human trafficking, the larger picture. There is no allegation that any of the defendants were involved with human trafficking. They are not being charged as such. But instead of talking about a particular defendant, I'd like to make the conversation broader, because this country needs to have a reality check on what's going on out there when it comes to forced labor and forced sexual conduct.
When did you first hear about the investigation?
Well, our prosecutors have been involved in this for some time. It's hard to pinpoint when. I've been aware of it for a while.
And what did you think when you first heard that this was happening, in your county?
I've been involved in fighting human trafficking for a while, so nothing surprises me. I give a lot of speeches on it. I'm on the Attorney General's statewide task force for human trafficking. So when this came across my desk, I was not surprised. I'm not surprised about the defendants. The defendants in these matters come from every socioeconomic group, and it's just a reality of the times we live in.
What do you think needs to be done on the supply side of this business in order to stop the problem of human trafficking?
It's a good question. What should be done on the supply side to stop human trafficking? Well, the laws are in place, but I think we need to do better about encouraging victims to speak up, because victims don't know that there are services available to them. They don't know that they could get their criminal records expunged or obtain a special visa to remain in this country. So if we would treat victims in this matter as victims and not as criminals, I think that you would gain the trust of more individuals to speak up on these matters. Because right now, a lot of them come from countries where the police are not their friends. And so they need to know that we're here to help them and treat them as the victims that they are. Terry?
Palm Beach County has a lot of similar enterprise-type businesses that have for years. I know I reported on it. It was one of those 15 years ago. But yet they seem to operate almost like in plain sight. What are you doing as state attorney? So you're focusing on human trafficking. But are you telling the police department, hey, in your jurisdiction, you need to look at these places and set up to?
Our human trafficking task force works with law enforcement to root out the human trafficking, whether at the storefront or on the internet. A lot of it occurs on the internet. Facebook is a very popular site used by human traffickers to recruit and groom potential victims. So we're working on them on a daily basis. But, there's a high burden of proof. We prosecutors can only file cases that reach the level of a burden of proof that we can obtain beyond a reasonable doubt. And so these cases are long in the making, but we hope that sometimes some of them can make a big enough splash to send a message to the rest of the country.
Can you talk about what federal agencies you've been working with?
Our Human Trafficking Task Force works with the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security.
So far, are the victims in this case cooperating?
The victims, well, that's up to investigators. They're working with victims on it. I can't say much on the status of that.
What's the threshold of evidence needed to charge in these cases,
Right.
specifically the Robert Kraft situation?
Police can charge based on probable cause. Is it more probable than not that a crime has occurred? Our standard is higher. For prosecutors to charge, we have to have a good faith belief that we can get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a higher burden, and it's why sometimes you will see that police will charge in some cases, and then we will decide not to file charges. And that's why we're having this press conference, because we've made the decision that enough evidence exists to file charges in all 25 of these cases.
So David,
I can get you next. I'll get you next. Yes. Yeah.
All walks of life.
Yeah.
What you say about speculation that someone like Kraft is targeted as a result of celebrity or his makeup or his fortune?
Yeah, I don't understand how someone could be targeted. You look at all the defendants in this matter, they come from all walks of life. There's rich, poor, there's young and old. So I don't believe anyone was targeted for whom they are. Yes, sir. Over here.
David, Dennis on the video has two parts. If the women are considered victims, does the video evidence affect the usage of the public tools? Does the video of the victims affect your use of that as a proceeding?
It shouldn't. The individuals involved, we're working with them, and I can't speak more about it as far as the victims to gain more information, but it should not affect our ability to use video ultimately if we need to in court.
What's the most important thing you need right now to meet that high burden of proof?
Well, the video evidence is always very powerful in a court of law. You also have, the testimony of some of the victims. I know that in many cases like this, there are language barriers and there are interpreters needed, and there's also a trust factor that must be gained. So we're working on all those things.
Can you be more specific about those women and how they got here?
How about this? Let's say, Karen, then I'll take you. I'll get you next. Yes, sir.
Is there any possibility that those who have been charged can somehow lead this away to a lesser charge?
Well, there are diversion programs available. There are classes available. So just because the mandatory penalty is up to a year in jail doesn't mean someone's going to get that. If it goes to trial, it's up to a judge, and you look at the person's background. First-time offenders are very unlikely to get significant jail time. So, there are, depending on the plea, depending on the background, depending on the conduct, these are all considerations that come into play.
But your office is open to a plea of a lesser charge by those who are charged.
Well, we don't talk about the status. That goes into too much detail that I can talk about this time. Yes, sir.
If you can you talk a little bit about the women? How do they get their answers to their story of how they got from wherever they were to where they were?
Yeah, that would be for the Jupiter Police Department. I say in cases like this, and I talk about it in generalities because I can't speak to the specific evidence. I can't talk about where they came from or how we broke this case because that could jeopardize any potential prosecutions. So let's just say that in cases like this, it is not uncommon for women to be lured into this country under false pretenses with the promise of a better life, a high-paying job, only to be stuck in squalor in a brothel or a sweatshop where they're forced to perform labor or sex acts for money.
Can you clarify how this process works for Robert Kraft? You said you determined he is a resident of Palm Beach County. You're issuing him a summons. Does that mean he has to appear in court, or can he send an attorney to appear in court?
Yes. So it's a summons, so he does not have to make a public court appearance.
So he can send an attorney to appear?
Correct.
And to clarify, does he face one or two charges?
Two charges. Yes, sir. How important is the cooperation? Well, if it goes to trial, their testimony obviously could be helpful, but if there's video evidence, that also is very powerful evidence. But I don't want to talk specifically to the evidence, but in general, video, eyewitness testimony are all important for any trial.
The Palm Beach County guys have recently for how they treat the rich and famous when they come to the criminal justice system. Now, I know Jeffrey Epstein did not have an underlying.
That was 3 administrations ago.
I understand. Do you want to talk about, set the record straight now, how are you handling it? What choices are you going to make in this investigation?
Yes, well, Florida voters passed into our Constitution something called Marcy's Law, which is the Victim's Bill of Rights. So we have already had a training session for all our prosecutors, and we are adhering to Marcy's Law. And as someone who campaigned for Marcy's Law, it's really important to all of us. We must let the victims' voices be heard.
Dave,
yes,
if Mr. Jones were found guilty and has to put them in the program, that's his $100,000.
Correct. Correct. Well, it also depends on the court. It depends on the judge and the court whether they make an arrangement, but that would be largely out of our hands. The judge imposes the sentence. Now, if there's a plea, then we have a lot more to say in it, but this is all speculation at this point. It's still early.
Someone just asked me, this might be actually like your purview, but the health department gave this place a clean bill of health. Do you understand how that might have happened? Were they just checking for whether the account was clean or looking for something?
You know, Al Johnson and I work on the Sober Homes Task Force, and when it came to drug treatment centers, we were often frustrated that the inspections that occurred were just to see if the fire extinguishers were working. So we upgraded the laws to help increase the inspections and the demands for what, and maybe that's something that needs to be done here too. Maybe there should be increased scrutiny.
Well, I mean, when TSA workers are told to look for human trafficking victims, it seems like a government worker inside, might have the same.
Yeah, you know, there are 328 million Americans, and there are about 800,000 law enforcement officers. So it's up to all of us to be the eyes and ears to protect against human trafficking, because a lot of this stuff occurs in plain sight. You know, it's like the nail salon worker who is living in the back room and who's not allowed to handle money and is afraid to look at you in the eye. If you see something, say something, and maybe that's the good that can come out of all this. Maybe we'll have a new understanding of what human trafficking is and what it isn't.
We could have last questions, please.
Well, it meant that there were two different occurrences in which he's being charged. It's just what it is, that instead of one charge or two, there are two counts, and so he faces two separate counts and have to satisfy those counts with a plea and move on from there. It could. It could. I'll take one more. All right. Hey, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, the press conference there in Florida now just beginning to wrap up. Just a few new details about the human trafficking ring, the bust there, the number of people arrested, some of the very serious crimes that have been charged. And joining me now is Rick Leventhal, who had a chance to listen in on this press conference with us just over the course of the last couple of minutes. What strikes you as you listen to this?
Well, a couple of things. We had been told initially that there were as many as 200 people involved in this sting, and that we might learn more names, which we did not. But they did say the investigation is ongoing. When they asked the state attorney about whether there was a bigger fish, because that was another rumor, he said it would be news to me. So we don't know whether that's the case, but we do know that Bob Kraft is among those who was arrested, and he's obviously notorious and very famous as the owner of the New England Patriots, who won 6 Super Bowls, including the most recent one in February. This is a guy who's worth $6.6 billion, according to estimates, and was caught apparently by police on surveillance footage from inside a massage parlor, paying for sex, a guy who went there 2 days in a row, Molly, as we just learned, January 19th and January 20th. January 20th was the day the Patriots played the Kansas City Chiefs in the AFC Championship game in Kansas City. And he was, according to the authorities, in this massage parlor at 10 in the morning. And that night, he was in Kansas City celebrating the Patriots' win over the Chiefs.
Well, you know, the Patriots have a really solid team. We saw they're just won their most recent Super Bowl, so they seem like they function just fine on the field, regardless of what's happening with Robert Kraft behind the scenes. Well, but there's fascinating detective work that's also revealed throughout some of the documents we're getting.
The authorities were watching this massage parlor and others, and when these men would leave, who they had apparently caught on video, they would do traffic stops. They'd pull over the vehicle the men were in and then get their identification, but not tell them why they were that they were actually being pulled over in connection with this human trafficking ring. So they pulled them over and got their names, and they pulled over Kraft's white Bentley, they say, according to court documents, and got his identification, his driver's license. So he will, in fact, be charged, it sounds like, with 2 counts of solicitation of prostitution, a first-degree misdemeanor, which could, as we heard from the prosecutor, carry up to a year in jail. Now, that's not likely with a first offender, but I want to read you, first of all, the NFL statement on this, because the NFL has weighed in, because it has a personal conduct policy, and it says our personal conduct policy applies equally to everyone in the NFL. We will handle this allegation in the same way we would handle any issue under the policy. We are seeking a full understanding of the facts while ensuring that we do not interfere with an ongoing law enforcement investigation. We will take appropriate action as warranted based on the facts. And, of course, Robert Kraft, his spokesperson, released a statement after his name popped up in connection with this investigation. And the spokesperson said, "We categorically deny that Mr. Kraft engaged in any illegal activity. Because it is a judicial matter, we will not be commenting further." One other note here, Molly. Bob Kraft did not let this get in the way of his good times, because we know he went to L.A. over the weekend. He was there for some pre-Oscar parties. TMZ Sports got some video of him celebrating at one of those parties, and you see him, I guess, exiting that party right there. We also have seen images of Bob Kraft landing in Boston today with Tom Brady and Gisele Bündchen and exchanging hugs and then heading off. So he spent a weekend in L.A. and he's back in Boston, and now he has, or will be mailed, it sounds like, a summons for this prostitution.
And they determined he has a residence down there in the area, which changes how you might be affected by this. But potentially, you know, an attorney might be handling the majority of this for him. The real question is, will he get community service? Will he have to attend an educational class?
It sounds like he's going to be facing at least 60 days behind bars, but he could negotiate that down. I'm sure your legal guest will weigh in on that. But he also is going to have to take a class, and he might have to do up to 100 hours of community service. And again, he's not the only one. One other name that popped up was John Havens, a former chief operations officer of Citigroup. He was also among those 25 who were caught on tape, and there could be as many as 175 more. And we will find out in the coming days and weeks.
You mentioned we do have a legal guest. It's Kim Whaley, former assistant U.S. attorney, former associate independent counsel in the Whitewater investigation. Kim, thanks for joining us. You know, fascinating to watch this unfold. We've got a few more details there. The Palm Beach County State Attorney's Office, Dave Ehrenberg, said essentially that these are victims of human trafficking, calling it modern-day slavery, and that these cases aren't about any one defendant. But certainly the fact that Robert Kraft was among those caught in this investigation, police believe, then that has certainly drawn attention to this. What sort of repercussions are there for Mr. Kraft and the other men that the attorney's office was talking about today?
Well, as your prior guest mentioned, you know, for each count, I think it carries 60 days in prison, and he'll have excellent lawyers, presumably, that potentially could get some kind of a deal where he'd have something short of a prison sentence. So the police officers focus on the bigger issue here, which is the extent to which this is a sex trafficking scheme, that is, girls brought from other countries, you know, sort of conned into coming to the United States, losing their passports, living in inhumane conditions. That's extraordinarily disturbing. And if Mr. Kraft's arrest draws attention to that because of his fame and his fortune, then I think the system of justice has done its job, at least for now.
You know, one of the other fascinating things that we've seen is just the amount of police work that goes into this. They asked if some of the reporters there in the scene asked if the women were cooperating, if some of the women that were involved were cooperating, and they talked about how investigators are working with those women. But in this particular case, there's an enormous amount of surveillance that was done. And as reporter Rick Leventhal just talked about, there were also some vehicle traffic stops to get IDs from gentlemen. So do they have enough evidence that this can't be swept away? Do they need the actual cooperation of the women?
Well, if they have surveillance tapes where there's actually an exchange and it's videoed, it's difficult to get better evidence than that. And of course, we're talking misdemeanor charges. And what a misdemeanor means is that you can't go to jail for more than under a year. So a felony is something that you go to jail for over a year. A misdemeanor, as people know, is a lot smaller. And so in terms of the implications there, so my guess is this kind of evidence would put anybody in jeopardy. But as we indicated earlier, we've got a very big fish with a lot of money. And so his liability, his reputation arguably tarnished. But let's hope that to the extent to which this has been going on for a long time, this sting is going to unravel something that is really unacceptable as a matter of just basic human rights in the United States.
David Ehrenberg also talked about the women being pulled into this, essentially being misled, brought here, and then living as modern-day slaves. He also talked about this being fueled by the demand side. You talked about the attention that this was now getting as far as these big arrests were concerned. I mean, is that the ultimate takeaway here, that this is the wrong thing to do, that people need to be educated about this, that there's a far greater human toll than whatever personal desire you may have in the moment?
Yeah, I think it's very much below the radar. We think about human trafficking happening in other parts of the world, Asia, perhaps parts of Europe, but it does happen in the United States. I lived for a year in Oklahoma. I know at traffic stops or stops along the highway, girls were trafficked because I knew prosecutors there. There's been exposés around Washington, D.C., where I live, blocks from the White House, young girls trafficked from their high schools. And basically, once they get into one of these rings, they can't get out. And I think for children, that is a tremendous tragedy. But of course, for these people, they don't have the resources. They don't have the lobbying money. They don't have